Mary King threw the strand of pearls on her bed, her eyes blazing with anger. My mother! My stupid, stupid mother! How can she do this to me? Tomorrow was her graduation from high school, and she had spent the day at the lake with her friends. Each of them had brought the gift that their parents had given for graduation, and now they were all watching to see what Mary's mother had given her. How could she possibly face them and show them that she had just been given this old string of beads? And that wasn't the worst of it. While her friends had been out shopping with their mothers for new outfits to wear, her mother had insisted on hand-sewing a plain, simple dress, and now she expected her to wear this necklace with it. It was just humiliating. As Mary dressed for bed, she noticed an envelope on the top of the dresser. It was from Mr. Morse. Mr. Morse had been like a father to her. She and her mother had lived with him as long as she could remember. He had often given her gifts. I bet at least there's a check in here, she thought to herself. But as she tore open the envelope, there was no check, just a long letter. She sat on her bed and started to read. Dear Mary, I had planned on giving you a check for your graduation, but that can come later. I happened to be at the beach a couple of days ago and couldn't help but overhear what you were saying to your friends. You said that you wished that your mother's face was pretty like their mother's instead of all red and cross-looking. You said that you wished your mother's hair was thick and curly like their mother's, not thin and straight and stringy. And you said that it was always so embarrassing to go anywhere with your mother because her one foot dragged a little bit when she walked, and you always thought that everyone was staring at you. That's when I knew that more than a check, you needed a story. Mary rolled her eyes. Has everyone gone crazy around here, she thought, but she continued to read. Many years ago, a young couple moved into town, a newlywed couple. Everyone could see how much they loved each other. The bride was so young and pretty and had such a bright smile, and he was tall and handsome. But being in a small town, it didn't take long before all the townspeople came to know what their story was. The husband was the son of a wealthy mill owner in a nearby city in eastern Pennsylvania. His father had already picked out the girl that he thought his son should marry. She was the daughter of a colleague of his, another prominent family in town. When the son insisted on marrying this other girl, who the father thought was far beneath his station, the father became angry and told him that if he married the girl, that was it. He was disowning him. He would never receive another cent from him. And so the two had moved to a nearby town to start a new life. The husband had never had to work before, so he wasn't used to hard labor, but he was willing to take any job that would come his way, and the wife worked really hard too, and bit by bit they saved enough to be able to build a little house on the hill, and they were very happy. But then one day there was an accident. The scaffolding the husband had been standing on collapsed beneath him. His co-workers carried his bruised and bleeding body to their little home and laid him on the bed. That very night a little girl was born to them. Oh, how he fought to live for that little girl, but after a short time he was gone. The father-in-law, still bitter at the girl because he blamed her for taking his son away from him, sent word that he would take the child and raise her as his own. She would lack for nothing, only the mother was never to have contact with her again. The mother sent back word, I love her too much. I'll find a way to provide for her. And she did. She continued to work every job that came her way. Eventually she was offered a position as a teacher of young children, and the job included room and board and a place for her and her daughter to live. And they were very happy there. Then one day, when the little girl was about 3 years old, the mother was downstairs reading a book when she heard a cry that struck terror in her heart. Fire! Fire in the west wing! That's where her little girl was. She threw down the book and flew up the stairs, 2 and 3 at a time. By the time she reached the third landing, the smoke was curling down the hall from the bedrooms. She dropped to the ground and felt her way through the smoke. Minutes passed. When firefighters on the main floor saw a figure stumble down the stairs. Her face, her hands, and her feet were badly burned. All her hair was gone. But in her arms she was carrying a bundle wrapped in a quilt, and from her hand dangled a strand of pearls. "I'm badly hurt," she whispered, "but I have rescued my two greatest treasures. Please keep them safe for me," and she collapsed to the ground. For weeks she writhed in agony. No one expected her to live, but she was fighting to live for that little girl. Slowly she started to heal, and then one day word came to her again from the father-in-law. "Give me the child, and I will raise her as my own. She will lack for nothing." And again word was sent back. "I love the child too much. I'll find a way." Mr. Morse continued. "That's when I stepped in. I built a large home far enough away from the town so that no one would know what had happened, and you and your mother have lived here ever since. I've watched your mother find work to do with her hands, even though they were stiff and painful to use. Many times I passed by her room and found her on her knees pleading for strength. I watched her carefully save every penny she could so that you could go to college. I wanted to tell you these things, but she made me promise that I would never tell you. She said it would kill her to have your pity. She wanted you to love her just for who she was. But when I heard you talking to your friends like that, I just couldn't keep silent any longer. Now, you must never tell her that I've told you these things. Sincerely, A. E. Morse." Mary sat in stunned silence, and then hot tears started flowing down her cheeks. How could she have been so selfish? All this time she thought it was Mr. Morse that was sending her to college, but no, it was her mother. All those times that she was embarrassed that her mother always wore the same homemade dress, she did it because she was saving her money for her. "Dear God, please forgive me," she whispered. She now heard her mother's familiar footsteps coming towards her room. Her mother knocked on the door. "Mary, is everything okay?" Mary remembered her promise to not let her mother know she knew, so she hurried to wipe the tears from her face. "Oh, come on in. I guess it's just the excitement of the graduation and everything tomorrow." "Mother, the pearls, they're beautiful. Have you had them long?" "Oh, yes, I've had them for many years. Your father gave them to me. He had to work so hard to earn them. I love every pearl on that string. I saved them for you once in the long ago because I wanted you to have something that he had earned for us." Mary could hardly speak. She just gently wrapped her arms around her mother and held her close for the longest time, and then whispered, "Truly, I have the most beautiful mother in all the world." It's been more than 50 years ago that I first heard this story. I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, but it made such an impression on my heart that every time I see a pearl necklace, it makes me think of this story. I remember clearly the little book my Sunday school teacher read it from. In fact, every time I saw a little book of stories that looked like that, I would open it and look for the story again. Now, I'm going to come back to the story of the pearls, but I want to push a little pause button for a few minutes and tell you about a project I've been working on. My husband and I have raised 9 children. As our youngest was getting ready to leave home about 10 years ago, I had this really strong impression to create a small library of books for children that would fill them with hope. It was to be a library of hope. I didn't know anything about publishing books, and I even thought it was a little presumptuous that I would be able to make such a selection. But the feeling was such that I started looking around, and I soon discovered a wonderful treasury of children's books written before 1923. And the good news was these books were not bound by copyright restrictions, so we could easily republish them. At first, I focused on American history stories, and I filled over 12 volumes with stories, and I called it the Freedom Series because these wonderful storytellers wove lessons into the stories that taught children how to hold on to freedom. I learned things I never knew before, and I was so anxious to share these with families. But I ran into a problem. How do you make them appeal to children who aren't reading so much anymore, who are used to flashy video games and entertainment? And I knew that the rich, beautiful language they used could be a barrier to many children. I pondered over this for many months, and then, one day when I was visiting out in Utah, I was heading out the door to go out to dinner when I had a feeling that I can best describe as how you feel when someone walks up to you and says, "Come here for a minute, I want to show you something." So I slipped downstairs to get onto my computer for a minute, and I went on Internet Archive where I spend most of my time, and I said out loud, "I don't know what I'm looking for." And a key word came into my mind that I entered in. A long list of books came up, and I started scrolling through them until I came to one title that seemed to jump out at me. It wasn't a particularly interesting title. It was The Use of Story in Religious Education by Margaret Egleston. I started reading and immediately knew this was the answer I was looking for. Before I went to bed that night, I discovered there had been a revival in the art of storytelling about 100 years ago for the very purpose I was looking for, to warm and open up the hearts of children so that they want to learn more. I found a whole circle of warm-hearted storytellers and educators who started teaching me how to reach the hearts of children. Opportunities started coming to me to share what I was learning, and as I taught about restoring the art of storytelling in our homes, I found the stories that I most often told and that made the deepest impressions were Margaret Eggleston's, like this one. One day, Margaret went to visit a friend, and when she walked in the front door, she could hear her friend's 6-year-old son, John, upstairs kicking and screaming and throwing things. The mother explained that he had disobeyed her one time too many and had been sent up to his room without his supper. Margaret asked if she could go upstairs and see if there was something she could do. The mother didn't think it would do any good, but she agreed to let her try. As she entered the bedroom, she found John curled up in a heap at the foot of the bed. He didn't even look up at her. So she sat down on the floor and proceeded to say, "I think I'll tell you a story. You needn't listen, of course. Away up in the far north, where it is very, very cold, there lived a little boy who had a sled. Now, he didn't pull this sled with a rope. Oh, no. He hitched it up to 4 little dogs, and how they would fly over the snow." By this time John was facing her and had stopped kicking. Slowly and quietly, Margaret unfolded the story of little Jimmy Standby of Labrador, who had stood by the dogs all through the night and the day in the bitter cold because he had promised Dr. Grenfell he would stand by. As the story progressed, John crept closer and closer to her until he had crawled up in her lap, his face eagerly looking into her face as he followed Jimmy Standby to the very end. When Margaret stood up to leave, John said, "Please, will you ask my mom if I can come downstairs for just a minute? There's something I need to tell her." After some coaxing, the mother agreed, and John, with his dirt-streaked little red face, came down the stairs and, walking right up to his mother, said, "She's told me a nice story, and I want you to know I'm going to have a name like his. I'm going to be Jimmy Standby, too." And he walked upstairs like a man. When Margaret was asked if storytelling really made a difference, she answered the question with this story. One day she told a story to a group of adolescent boys, among which was a sort of a rebel. She didn't think that he was even paying attention to the story. It was the story of a young boy who had a job sweeping up a bank at closing time. As he went to empty one of the trash cans, he noticed a large roll of money that had accidentally been thrown away. As he held it in his hands, he thought how much this money would mean to his family. His father drank a lot, and he spent most of what he earned on drinking. The little bit of money the boy brought in went towards food and for medicine for his mother, who was very ill. The doctor had told him that if he didn't find a way to get medicine for his mother and move her out to the country where she could get fresh air, she probably wouldn't live even past the fall. He looked around and saw that no one had noticed him, so he slipped the money in his pants pocket and headed home. Along the way the money felt heavier and heavier in his pocket. He moved it first to his outside jacket pocket, and then to the inside pocket. But the closer he got to home, the heavier the money felt, until at last he realized he just couldn't keep that money. He headed back to the bank where a security guard let him in. He marched straight to the bank president's office, knocked on the door, walked in, and threw the money across the desk to the president, explaining how he had come by it. The president looked surprised. "Son," he said, "I know how much this money would mean to you and your mother. No one knew you had it. Why did you bring it back?" Without hesitating, the boy leaned across the desk and, looking straight into the eyes of the president, said, "Sir, as long as I live, I have to live with myself, and I don't want to live with a thief." That was the story. There had been no particular reaction to it, and Margaret lost contact with this young man until several years later when she received a letter from him. He was now a soldier fighting on the war front in France. As she opened it, she read, "Years ago, on a wet and rainy day when the ice was dangerous on the sidewalk, you came and told a story to a group of boys. I don't remember the details of the story, but I remember how it ended. As long as I live, I have to live with myself, and I don't want to live with a thief." That one story has kept me from lying and stealing and from being a coward, and here in France, it has kept me true to my manhood. I have a class here in the barracks. I know that may be hard to believe, but some of my men need that story. In fact, I want it for all of them. For all that I am, I owe to that one story, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. There was another story Margaret told that I loved, but there was something about the story. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something I was understanding just wasn't right. She had reluctantly included it in the final chapter of her book. Although she had told the story several times, it was of such a personal nature that she just didn't feel comfortable putting it out there for just anyone to read. Yet she felt she should include it. She had happened to step into a Sunday school class one day when the young men in the class had been grilling the teacher. "Does anyone really know there is a God?" He had exhausted all his answers, but still had not satisfied them. Margaret looked into their sincere and eager faces and said, "Boys, yes, I do know there is a God. If you'll come back next week, I'll tell you how I know." The next week, all the boys were there, plus a few extra, as she unfolded this story. Some years previous, her father, as I understood, had been diagnosed with a serious illness. The doctor said he needed to be out in the fresh country air, undisturbed by anyone or anything. He needed quiet. It was decided that they would head to a campsite in Maine, where she had already spent several summers. They took with them a little girl of 7. I wasn't sure who she was, but I thought maybe it was a little sister or a helper. Over the next several weeks, the father seemed to be doing a little bit better. The flowers were in full bloom, and they picked fresh blackberries that grew in abundance in the hills around them. And then one day he took a turn for the worse. The doctor was sent for from the nearest town 20 miles away. He left them with some medicine and went on his way. It seemed to give some relief, and they had all gone to sleep when Margaret heard some noise at the flap of the tent. The doctor had returned. He quickly explained that the blood work had shown there was a poison that had spread throughout the system of the sick one, and the medicine he had left wouldn't do any good. It was a very serious situation. The doctor gave her new medicine and told her she'd have to administer it every 15 minutes throughout the night. But even with that, he said death could come at any moment. He was very sorry, but he could only stay a little while because he had other patients to tend to. As he left, Margaret stood at the opening of the tent and watched his lamp fade away into the forest, and she was alone again. She began to administer the medicine as she'd been instructed. In between dosages, she tried to write letters, but her hands were shaking too much. She tried to read, but she couldn't concentrate. It was now the middle of the night. She stood at the opening of the tent, wrapping both hands around the pole, bracing herself against the night breeze. and for the first time in her life, she was afraid, really afraid. The moon shone on the lake before her and reflected on the hills on the opposite shore. As she looked out into the stillness of that scene, the same words that came to the psalmist came to her mind. I will lift mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord who made heaven and earth. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord shall preserve thee. The words came again, only this time she repeated them softly, aloud. I will lift mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. But this time as she spoke the words, a peace and a comfort filled her whole soul, and the fear completely left her. She felt strengthened and ready to face the hard things. Finally the morning broke, and death had passed them by. After a pause she quietly said, Boys, that's why I know there is a God. And they were satisfied. Well, remember how I said I'd been looking for the story of the pearls for over 50 years? A couple of years ago I happened to be in a thrift store and I found a little book of stories. I opened it up and there it was. I was so excited to find it that I stood in the aisle and I read it right there. It was exactly as I'd remembered. But what I didn't expect, and what caught me completely by surprise, was that at the end of the story it said, by Margaret Egleston. Shortly after I'd found the story again, I was invited to our state girls' camp. They wanted me to come after dark when the girls were gathered around the campfire and tell them a story. You can guess the story I told them. It got me thinking about Margaret Egleston again, and after I told the story, I wondered if she had any other books of stories. I looked and found she had another book published in 1921, the year after her first book. It was called Fireside Stories to Tell to Teenage Girls. As I glanced through the titles of stories, there was my story of the pearls. I smiled at the coincidence that I had just told a story in a campsite to teenage girls that Margaret had specifically written to be told at the campfire to a group of teenage girls. Well, more months passed by as I continued working on my project. And I had one of those moments, when you've been working on something really hard and you stop and pause long enough to reflect on what you've accomplished. Well, as I thought about it, I had now filled nearly 60 volumes with stories of all kinds from this wonderful golden age of children's literature. I'd also selected and organized an online library for families from the same literature and had over 2,000 books available. I'd spent several months going through my stacks of notes, trying to organize what I'd been learning about reaching the hearts of children so I could share it with others, and I had recorded over 6 hours of audios that we posted online. But mostly I thought about how much my own life had been enriched by spending so much time with all these stories and storytellers. I can't even begin to describe the joy that has come into my own life, and I have been filled with so much hope. But mostly my thoughts turned to Margaret, and I thought, Margaret, you're the one who opened the door to all this for me and introduced me to all your friends, and I felt so grateful to her. I looked at my bookshelf and I saw her book, the one that had started it all, The Use of Story in Religious Education, and I started to reread it. Knowing what I now knew, I appreciated even more the depth of her wisdom. I could feel the goodness of her soul, and I found myself wondering, Margaret, who are you? What do you look like? I went online to see if I could find out more about her, and I searched and searched, and I couldn't find anything at all, only a birth year, that she'd been born in 1878. I told my husband how disappointed I was that I couldn't find anything about her, and he suggested that I get on a site that has a lot of public records and see if I could learn more about her that way. I never knew before how many Margaret Eglestons there are in the world, and I wondered if I was ever going to be able to find my Margaret Egleston. So I went back to her book to see if I could find some more clues. On the title page it said that she was a teacher at Boston University, and she dedicated the book to her little daughter. In 1920, when she wrote it, she would have been 42, so I assumed she must have had only one child because you wouldn't single out one child if you had others, would you? So using those clues, we found her in Boston in the 1920 census. She was living with her widowed mother, Elizabeth White, age 72, and her 13-year-old daughter, who I noted would have been born around 1907. What I was sad to learn was that Margaret was also a widow. What happened, I wondered. We found her again in the 1910 census. She was living in Brooklyn, Kings County, New York. Her husband, Gurdon Egleston, was a clergyman, and they had a little 3-year-old daughter. So now I knew I was looking for a death certificate of Gurdon between 1910 and 1920. We found one in 1914, but it said that he died in Stoneham, Oxford. I told my husband that I didn't think that was him because wasn't that England? My husband said, "Hold on a minute," and he said, "No, Stoneham, Oxford is in Maine." I pulled out a map and found Oxford. It sits at the northern tip of a lake, about 20 miles from the nearest large town. Suddenly I realized what I had missed in the previous story. Margaret had worded it so that I wasn't clear who the people were in the story. She referred to the father of her family, and I assumed it was her father. Now I knew it wasn't her father at all. It was her husband. The little girl of 7 was their little girl. This was the story of how she faced the illness of her own husband, and the story became even more meaningful to me because I also had a husband who faced a serious illness. I wasn't alone out in the wilds of Maine, but I felt just as alone. I know well the fear that overtakes you in the dark hours of the middle of the night. I too had felt that comfort and peace pour into me that gave me the strength to face the hard things. Only my husband had been restored to health. Now I learned that Margaret had to say goodbye to hers. In the story it said death passed by for the time, but evidently not for long, as the death certificate said he passed away in the middle of the summer on July 31st, 1914, just before his 36th birthday. The cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage from a brain tumor. What more could her stories teach me about her, I wondered. I went back to the fireside book. I'd only quickly scanned through before, but now I read it very carefully. The first story was about a young woman who had been told by the doctor in the spring that her father was very ill and she needed to take him somewhere quiet where they wouldn't be disturbed. So she took him to a little cabin in New Hampshire. As winter approached and she became fearful, she went to the lake and was strengthened as she looked at the hills from whence cometh her strength. The details of the story had been changed, but I clearly recognized that this was based on her own true story. Then it hit me. What I had learned from Margaret was that stories that will make the deepest impact and will leave the most lasting impression are those you draw from personal experience. Was it possible that the story of the pearl necklace, that for all these years I had assumed was a good story but purely fictional, was actually based on true events in the life of this woman who has come to have such a great influence on my own life? I certainly knew she was a practical woman. I couldn't imagine her making up a sensational story just to stir emotion. She would have grounded it in true events, and I started looking for evidence to back it up. I discovered that her mother, Elizabeth White, immigrated from England in 1870 when she was 22 years old. In the fireside stories, I found several stories about an Elizabeth who had come from far across the ocean. The only work she could find was working in a factory, and she couldn't afford to live anywhere but a boarding house. One story told how lonely she was and how she longed for a friend. Some of the rich people in the town snubbed her, but she caught the eye of one of their most popular and favorite sons, who was attracted to her goodness. In the story of the pearl necklace, the wealthy mill owner lived in eastern Pennsylvania. When the young couple married, they moved away to a small town nearby. Margaret, was born in Walton, New York. It was a small town then, and it's a small town today, and it lies just over the northeast border of Pennsylvania. After the fire, Mr. Morse took the little girl and her mother to a place far enough away that no one would know what had happened to her. In the story, Margaret describes how they loved to play at the lake. There's a lake about 100 miles north of Walton, Oneida Lake, and not far from the lake is a little college town, Kirkland, New York. And in the 1900 census, I found the name of a college student there, Gurdon Egleston. Now I found a story about May, with an M, about to graduate from college. Several young men are interested in her. Should she choose the rich one, so she can always have plenty of money? Or should she choose the football star, who always made her laugh? Or maybe she should choose the scholar. She didn't know what to do, and sought the advice of a favorite professor who told her she should look at them through the eyes of who would she want to be the father of her children. She had gone back to her room to think about it, and she found bouquets of roses from all her suitors. But there was also a plain lunch box. She opened it and found it filled with forget-me-nots, which she loved. But who were they from? She placed a few of the flowers in her hair and tucked some in her belt and left for the ceremonies. On the way, she saw her friend Jean, with a G. "Oh, I see you got my flowers," he said. He said that he had left early in the morning because he wanted to pick up his mother to bring her to meet her, and along the way he spotted the forget-me-nots, which he knew she loved, emptied his lunchbox and filled it with the flowers and put them on the mail train that was just going by. He had hoped they would get to her. May had met Jean in her geology class, and they had spent many happy hours combing the hillsides looking for rocks and wildflowers. He was always so courteous and cheerful and good-natured, even when things weren't going right. And here he was being so sweet to his little mother. Yes, Jean is the one she would choose to get to know better. One more little piece of evidence that would seem to back up the story. In 1921, Margaret applied for a passport. By the way, it had a picture of Margaret in it, and she was beautiful. As part of the application, she had to include an affidavit of someone who could vouch that they knew her. And that was her mother, Elizabeth White. If you were to look at the signature, you would see that it was clearly written by a hand that wrote with great difficulty, which the story of the pearl necklace would have explained. Now, I can't say for sure that the story of the pearl necklace is true. Details of the story were likely changed, but I believe the evidence suggests it was based on true events of Margaret's life and the life of her mother, and somehow that just makes the story even more meaningful to me. As I mentioned, my husband loves to do family history, and he likes to see if people are related to him. So he searched on the family tree search, and he found that somebody had already placed Gurdon Eggleston's name in their family tree. He didn't have to go back very many generations before he found Gurdon's family line merged with one of my husband's family lines. But what was missing on the record, what was left blank because it was unknown, was that Gurdon had a wife and a little girl. But it's not left blank anymore. Almost exactly 100 years from that sorrowful parting in a lonely campsite on a lake in Maine, the names of Margaret White Egleston and Gurdon Egleston with their little girl have been reunited, always and forever. Now, you're here at a homeschool conference. You've come looking for ideas to teach your children. Maybe you're looking for curriculum and practical tips. So why have I spent your time telling you about Margaret Egleston? Well, I have lots of reasons. First of all, I wanted you to feel the difference between a story and information. What if I'd introduced Margaret this way? Margaret White was born in Walton, New York in 1878. She married Gurdon Egleston, a clergyman, who died in 1914. In 1920, while teaching at Boston University, she wrote a book, The Use of Story in Religious Education. Would you have cared about her? Would you have any pictures of her in your mind? Would she have any personality? Did you notice how each story revealed a different facet of her personality? The function of story is to stir feeling and awaken emotion. We use words like dry, cold, and hard to describe facts, but stories breathe life into them. Stories help us to care. They fire up desire and passion. If you find the right story, you can create an interest in any subject. Stories help us to see clearly and to understand things in our hearts that our eyes alone cannot comprehend and that facts alone cannot reveal. Stories are one of the most important tools you have in teaching your children. My grown-up son recently finished reading a story for a second time, Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. He happened to be home when he finished reading it, and I was in the kitchen when he came in and said, "Wow," and again, "Wow." If you read a book like that, you know exactly what was going on inside of him. To borrow scriptural words, it was enlarging his heart, enlightening his mind, and it tasted delicious to him. It was good fruit. The deeps of our souls, like the deeps of the ocean, are silent, and I didn't want to intrude on the work that was taking place deep inside of him with mere chatter. In ways I don't fully understand, that story was making him better and wiser, and thereby happier. Not all books have that effect on us. What gave this book that power? And my answer is that it has everything to do with the heart through which the story flows. Charles Dickens had a happy childhood. He was a voracious reader and loved to spend time out in nature, but that season of his life came to an abrupt end when he was just 11 and his father was thrown into a debtor's prison. Dickens was left to wander the streets and fend for himself. He ended up working 10-hour days in a rat-infested, tumble-down shoe-blacking factory. Over the next while, he experienced a cold, bleak winter of life, where he knew hunger, loneliness, poverty, and despair. As miserable as it was, the experience enlarged his heart, and that carried into his writings. But there's another heart through which Tale of Two Cities flowed. Thomas Carlyle had been encouraged by his dear friend John Stuart Mills to write on the French Revolution. After 5 months of painful toil, he gave his one and only manuscript of Volume 1 to Mills for suggestions before sending it on to the publisher. Weeks passed, and Carlyle hadn't heard anything from his friend, so he paid him a visit and found that his friend had loaned the manuscript out where it had been carelessly left on the parlor floor. The housekeeper thought it was trash, and she used it to light the hearth fires. Mills was absolutely beside himself with grief. He could think of no way to repair the damages, although he did offer monetary compensation. To Carlyle's credit, he confided to his wife Jane, "Mills, poor fellow, is terribly cut up. We must endeavor to hide from him how serious this business of life is for us." And serious it was. The Carlyles had no money. They had hoped this work would help lift them from their poverty, and he had already destroyed his notes. Carlyle wrote, "I remember and can still remember less of it than of anything I ever wrote with such toil. It is gone." He had no hope of recovering it. But that night he had a dream in which his father and brother begged him to not abandon the work. The next morning he accepted enough money from Mills to buy paper, and he started writing again. First he wrote volumes 2 and 3. Then he went back to recreate volume 1, writing the entire manuscript from memory, using words, as Carlyle himself described, that came, quote, direct and flamingly from the heart. He said, "It is as if my invisible schoolmaster had torn my copybook when I showed it and said, 'No, boy, thou must write it better.' The result was a masterpiece that has remained in print to this day. He wrote as though he was a participant to all the events of the French Revolution, bringing it to life in such a way that the reader feels like he, too, is there. It was this work that Charles Dickens read and reread, and that inspired him to write his Tale of Two Cities. My son simply had to pull the book off a shelf, open and read, and the souls and understanding of both Carlyle and Dickens poured into him. My son got to eat the fruit of the harvest made possible by someone else's hard labor. Thinking of that harvest got me thinking about the seasons. I'm not an historian, but I've read enough stories of nations to see the cycles of history play out like the seasons of the year. Those who are born in the springtime of nations are born into a time of new beginnings. Fields have to be cleared by chopping down trees and pulling out the stumps. Clods of dirt have to be broken up so that new furrows can be dug deep in the earth for seeds to be planted. Seedlings have to be gently watered and nourished so they can take root. Those who labor in spring have their eye toward the harvest. Then comes the summer. Those who are born in the summertime get to bask in the sunshine and care for the fields that have already been planted. Their job is to tend the growing plants by pulling out the weeds and to keep an eye out for pests and disease. But they are still not the ones who get to eat the fruit of all those labors. The eyes of those who labor in the summer also are toward the harvest. Happy and blessed are those who get to live in autumn, the much-anticipated time of the harvest. They are the ones who get to eat the sweet, juicy fruit that has ripened on the vines. While harvesters feast from the hard labor of those who came before, though, wise harvesters have their eye on the coming winter because they know winter always follows autumn. They know that if they preserve and store up a portion of the fruit of the harvest, they'll make it through the cold months ahead when nothing will grow. We are most definitely living in the day of the harvest, and what a harvest it is! There has never been one like it in all of recorded history. Just as the wisdom and experience of Carlyle and Dickens was preserved within the covers of a book my son only had to pull off a shelf and read, so has the wisdom and experience of all ages been preserved and is now being made available to us in miraculous ways. A single book may contain an entire lifetime of someone's toil and effort. Today, we're not limited to the narrow view of our own experiences. We can see and experience life through thousands of eyes, and history has preserved the best of the best for us. Technology has brought the greatest works of all the ages from all around the world right to a little technological wonder that most of us own, a little iPad. Through that, our children can have front row seats at the Bolshoi Ballet or the Metropolitan Opera. They can stand next to Leonard Bernstein as he conducts the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. They can listen to the finest musicians from around the world play musical masterpieces. Then they can click replay and listen again. Our children can take a tour of fine art in a single afternoon that the richest kings and queens of yesterday couldn't have seen in a lifetime. They have instant access to the greatest literature of all time. When they come to a word they don't understand, they can simply click and learn its meaning. We owe a great debt to Noah Webster, who spent his life mastering 28 languages so that he could take each word in the English language one at a time and look at it through its roots and pass that understanding on to us. When our children come to a word they can't pronounce, just click, and there it is. Nibelungenlied, who would have thought? Where is this place again? Click away and it takes you to a map. Click again and you might even be able to view it. Can you not remember who a person is? Well, click and find. Forget a fact? Click and find. This is an education fit for royalty. We have the potential to raise the noblest, most cultured, most refined, the wisest and happiest generation to have ever lived. The eyes of those who have suffered, sweat, sacrificed, and starved to bring forth truths are upon us. What will we do with the fruit of their labors? Under the circumstances, is fitting our children to jobs the best our schools can offer? Is raising global workers in a global economy really the highest we can hope for our children? Will we sell their birthright for a mess of pottage? The field is white and all ready to harvest, but we're faced with a generation that has little desire to reap. Parents, this is your moment in history. Within your homes are the chosen harvesters, and it is your privilege, and upon you rests the responsibility to light fires of desire within their hearts. No one can do it better than you. Which brings me back to why I spent so much time introducing Margaret Egleston to you. She and her friends happen to be heart specialists. They know how to warm hearts. Their writings have been buried for nearly 100 years, but now, just when we need them, they're back, ready to teach us. Not only do they teach us how to do it, they left a huge treasury of stories for us to use to open and warm the hearts of our children, so that they'll want to learn more. This was their great gift to us. Nothing opens the heart like a good story. They gave us the gift of fairy tales. Albert Einstein once said that if you want your child to be intelligent, read him fairy tales. If you want him to be more intelligent, read him more fairy tales. Fairy tales have traveled to us over hundreds and even thousands of years. Along the way, rough edges were smoothed and sharp corners knocked off. They were passed orally from one generation to the next. Most survived because they were wrapped around kernels of moral truths, delivered in ways that young hearts understand. Hans Christian Andersen and the Grimm brothers were part of a small army of storytellers who were inspired to search them out and write them down. They found them in the deep jungles of Africa and South America, and in huts and villages from Tibet to Turkey. We owe a debt of gratitude to them. One more generation, and they may have vanished forever. There is nothing like a fairy tale to stir the imagination, or rather the power to create images in our minds, to visualize and to dream, without which none of us can create anything. Also in this treasure chest of stories are wonderful stories from nature that open children's hearts to, as Shakespeare put it, the tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and every good thing. Nature is an unlimited source of delight and joy to eyes that can see and hearts that can feel. They also gave us stories to help open hearts to the powerful and important lessons found in fine art and music. I have grown to love and appreciate these masterpieces in ways I never had before because of the stories they've left. They also retold the stories of Shakespeare, Dante, Cervantes, Homer, Chaucer, Spencer, and others in ways children will love and grasp, so they'll feel like old friends when they visit them later. In the introductions to their stories, they help us understand why these works of literature matter and open our hearts to want to learn more. From this era of storytellers has also come the enduring children's classics like The Secret Garden, A Little Princess, Little Women, Heidi, Anne of Green Gables, Treasure Island, Tom Sawyer, Pollyanna, and so many more. As much as I love all these stories, I think the greatest gift of all they gave us are the stories of history. These storytellers were scholars who had a gift of interpreting history in a way that a child's heart can understand and see. When in all of recorded history has there been a time like today when young people have access to a study of the rise and fall of all nations, the cost of freedom, the patterns and lessons by which civilizations prosper and flourish and what makes them die, what forms of government ensure the greatest happiness, and which ones make for the most misery? We've all heard the saying, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Maybe, just maybe, because of the stories now in our hands, we can raise a generation wise enough to not repeat the past. Who is writing history for children these days? You know, it's not exactly a bestseller. About the only place to make money with it is in writing textbooks, and there is nothing in a textbook to make a child care. Just as I brought Margaret Egleston to life through her stories, These storytellers bring the great men and women of history to life so they can have a real and personal influence on the lives of your children. Through stories, they can become some of their best friends. All of these wonderful stories were wrapped in love. These storytellers didn't shy away from sharing their love for the children. Dearest boys and girls, I love you. Signed, your loving friend, your affectionate friend. You will feel the warmth. I've dedicated my life to getting these stories into the hands of families like yours. At first, your children may find the language too rich and unfamiliar. The sentences are likely more complex than they're used to because we've dumbed down our language. Today, we use the same word to describe a sunset, a newborn baby, and a quarter-pounder bacon cheeseburger. They're all awesome. In the older books, they would have had a different word to describe each one. With simplified sentences, our children are losing the ability to sustain thought long enough to wrap their minds around a single idea. But if you will consistently start reading these older stories aloud, they'll soon feel comfortable and natural to them. And their vocabularies will grow in leaps and bounds, as will their attention spans. And their hearts will be filled with ideas and ideals. This is the day of the harvest. Already I see signs of approaching winter. The leaves are changing color and starting to drop off the trees. There's a chill in the air, but we don't have to be afraid. Within the harvest are lessons on how to survive harsh winters, and if we're wise, we will store enough to sustain us through cold winter months when nothing grows. Winter can be a time to rest from heavy labors, to wrap up in a warm blanket, sit in front of a fire, and reflect on things that really matter. Even on the coldest day of winter is found great beauty. Some of the greatest masterpieces of literature, art, and music have come from history's winters. And when the winter's day seems especially long and dark and dreary, we'll hold on to the hope and promise of spring, because spring always follows winter. Always. It will be a time of new beginnings, of clearing away rotting leaves and digging new furrows in the earth to plant the seeds saved from the fruits of fall's harvest. And there will be fresh, scented breezes. I'm well aware that the number of harvesters may be small. It usually is. But I baked enough bread to know that a little bit of leaven is enough to raise the whole loaf. Long ago and far away, I listened to a story of a strand of pearls. That story has lifted me up and changed my life forever. Lifting up and changing lives is the power of a story. Stories can heal our nation. Stories can heal our world. Don't underestimate the power of a story.